See my slides, right?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. So today I will present you this talk. So imagine that you complete a puzzle and some part of the puzzle are missing, and you need to store some puzzles in your visual working memory. So to do so, you need to remember two features actually, colors of each puzzle and the shape. And the question here, do you store both colors and shapes in bound way, or they just store completely in different uh, capacities? So the main question of our study are what are the units of visual working memory, and there are a lot of studies that demonstrated that there could be objects or as units in visual working memory, or it rather the features that are the units of visual working memory. A very famous study by Luck and Fogel demonstrated that regardless of the number of the feature, capacity of visual working memory is still the same and equal to 4 elements. However, the future experiments demonstrated that the increasing the number of the features within one object significantly decrease visual working memory capacity. Also, there are another factors which demonstrated that features could be forgotten separately, or for example, that there are some binding errors in visual working memory. All these factors suggest that it is rather not the objects who are main candidates for the units of visual working memory. But there are still some objects-based benefit. For example, it is easier to remember several features in the one object, like this, for example, than the same number of features distributed across several objects. So, like this. So in our research, we tried to answer this question, how it could be that on the one side, it seems that we have like some separate capacities for each feature. However, we still have some benefit from the object. It is possible that object representation somehow facilitates this separate feature storage. But another explanation that features are actually stored independently and we don't need any object representation at all. So in our all three experiments, we have like similar manipulation, but the experiments differs in terms of how features was presented in a set. So in experiment 1, we ask our participants to remember colors and orientation within one object. So we ask them to remember colors of the triangles and orientation of the triangles. In experiment 2 and 3, features was distributed across the objects. So we ask our participants to remember orientations of triangles and colors of circles. However, in experiment 2, these objects was separately distributed across locations different. And in experiment 3, we have some proto-objects because these objects was actually overlapped. Okay, so this is the main difference between all three experiments. And the main manipulation was the features. So we independently manipulate each feature dimension in such way that in some conditions, one feature was identical across all the objects and another was different. For example, we have color identical condition when colors was identical and rotation different. So what we wanted to see, if we have some object representation in our visual working memory, and it's rather that objects are stored as the main units, we should see that when colors are identical, we should see some benefit for orientation performance. And the same in orientation identical condition, we should see some changes in performance for remembering color when orientations are identical. But if features are if features stored completely separately, in all three experiments, we should see that this manipulation on one feature will not affect the performance on another feature. So the procedure was the following. We asked our participants to remember set of the objects, and after 1 second, we asked them to adjust one of the item. On 50% of trials, we ask participants to adjust the color. On another 50% of trials, the orientation. This procedure was random, so they don't know which feature they will be asked. So we need to store both orientations and colors. We applied to our data mixture model. So this is the distribution of participant answer. And this model allows us to get two parameters. First of all, probability of participants guessing the information. And the second is standard deviation, the parameter which is opposite to the precision of remembered information. So what we got in the result? On the right part of the screen, you can see the probability of item being in memory. So the higher the value, the better the performance. And as you can see, the dotted line is a baseline for one object, the red line for orientation, and the blue line for color. As we can see, when the feature was identical, this situation was completely similar to only one object presented on the screen. And the interesting results here. So the conditions with all different features and orientation identical did not differ in color performance, and the same, there's no difference in orientation performance when colors was identical, which means that color did not affect the performance on orientation, and orientation did not affect it on color. The same results we can see in the standard deviation plot. Here also no significant difference between these two and these two. Let's move to experiment 2. Here more interesting results. Here we find that there's still some influence from the color on the orientation. Where we find it? We find that there's some drop in performance when colors become different compared to the situation when colors was identical, which means that colors somehow affected the performance on orientation. The same situation we can see on the plot with the standard deviation. Also, very big standard deviation for the condition when all features was identical. This means that in experiment 2, when the features was already distinguished in different objects, we see some interactions between these features. Very interesting results. However, in experiment 3, we didn't find such interference as experiment 2. And the situation are actually pretty similar to experiment 1. We don't see any interference between different dimensions, and results pretty similar to experiment 1. So let's move to comparison between all three experiments. As we can see, the results on experiment 2, the performance is significantly lower than in all other experiments, and we can see the influence of color on the orientation performance here. And as we will move to the standard deviation plot, and also we can see again this influence, and also we can see that standard deviations are pretty high for experiment number 2. So what we got in the results? In the results, we have that the pattern is actually pretty similar between all three experiments. The one feature did not effect on the performance of another feature. So feature recall from visual working memory depends rather on within but not cross-dimensional load. However, we find that orientation memory was impaired by color memory load when only when features were spatially separated. So how it could be? The features are already separated, but we found that they somehow interact with each other. The possible explanation of this that we actually don't store features or objects in our visual working memory. It is rather some hierarchy or bundle where on different levels of information we stores both features and objects. This is not the new model, but this model actually explains our results. Why it explains our results? Because we find in experiment 1 and experiment 3 no interference between different features, which means that in experiment 1 and 3 we have some objects or proto-objects which could mediate with separate feature capacities for each dimension. But in experiment 2 we didn't have such mediator, which did not allow us to well compress information in our visual working memory. So thank you very much for your attention. This is my lab and my collaborators, and I will glad to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Yuri, thank you very much. There are exactly, I think, 93 people here. I'm sure they're all clapping awkwardly to themselves. Tim Brady has a question. Do you think there are chunking, grouping, ensemble things going on where people group across spatial locations using one feature or another sometimes?
Yeah, we thought about some chunking on ensemble stuff here. And it is possible that people are great when they have such ability and they create some chunks in experiment 1 and 3, but they cannot do it in experiment 2, so they need to create at least 2 chunks, and this ruins their performance. Yeah, it's one way of explaining such results.
Excellent. Let's see, Kirsten Adam has a question. Your great talk. It sounds like you think there's an effect of spatial extent rather than objecthood per se. For example, if you connected the spatially separate triangle/color blobs in experiment 2 with a line to make them one object, it sounds like you would predict this would not give a benefit. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, it's very speculative that we have real objects in experiment 3. We just overlapped some different features. So yeah, it's a quite interesting question. I don't know, maybe one way of thinking about it that actually spatial location play a big role here, allowing us to create such distinct capacities for different dimensions.
Excellent. Yuri, thank you very much. And to everyone else, we'll go ahead and start switching over now